Hello and welcome to Contemplations. We're on to episode 21 and I'm Josh and I'm joined by Hugo.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome.
Yeah, so this is something that I want to talk about in a broader discussion about egalitarianism. So this is going to be a two-part, as it usually is, but something more closely connected. So today we'll take a closer look at that specific kind of dilemma or a kind of double concept of these two things, right? Equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And then tomorrow we'll look at something else, at egalitarianism more generally. But I wanted to focus on this specific issue today because this is quite weird to me, that how the discussion often goes, because often it's it's presented like those are quite kind of opposites, and if you want one you can't want the other, and if you want the other you have to be the opponent of that first one. And I don't really see it like that, and I'm going to try to explain why, through explaining what those two concepts are and kind of talking about them a little bit. So let's do that. And so I think that the political discussion today is actually quite narrow, because the discussion is not about whether egalitarianism is good or whether equality is something that should be striven towards. And so I want to do that as well, but I want to do that tomorrow, right? Because that's going to be kind of the whether or the why discussion. And the discussion tomorrow is going to be just on those two topics of equality of opportunity and of outcome. And actually, in the political discussion that is usually had, that's how it is, right? It's just equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, and there's nothing else that you could kind of possibly imagine, right? Those are the two options that you can support or that you
That's
can defend.
all I really know. I know equality of outcome as evil and communist, and equality of opportunity as lovely and meritocratic and kind of democratic almost.
Okay, well, we'll go into that then.
Sure.
Because,
I imagine that you're going to have a few words to say about my preferred choice.
yeah, I mean, we're going to be talking about both in
Mhm.
length, so we'll see how each of us imagines the concept and what it leads to and stuff like that. And so, equality of outcome is often criticized for being, you already said that, either communist or unrealistic or unfair, right? So that's the kind of angles that are usually taken against equality of outcome. And then on the flip side, equality of opportunity is usually criticized for rewarding, quote unquote, people for things they haven't done themselves, for things that they haven't deserved, because it's not enough. So it's criticized from the equality of outcome point of view, right? And so if there are these two options of things that you can have, why can't you have both, right? That's the first question that you have to ask. Like, why can't you have both equality of opportunity and equality of outcome? Well, the problem is that if you equalize outcome, then you kind of run into conflicts with equality before the law, for example, because you're not the law is not approaching people in the same way. It's adjusting them to specific characteristics in order to achieve the outcome which would otherwise be unequal, right? That's the kind of classic argument, and that's how I see it as well. You can't have those two. If you imagine them like that, kind of in the simple way, you can't have those two together. And so, and even with some other kind of notions of equality, not all of them are compatible with each other. So it's not just about saying, okay, I like equality, so every type of equality that I can think of is going to be something I'm going to focus on and try to push towards, because those might be contradictory.
Yeah, they seem like mutually exclusive things in that they alter similar areas, as you mentioned, but in different ways. Therefore, they cannot coexist, because you'd have to pick one over the other if you were to kind of manifest this principle in society.
Yeah, and actually the argument that I made, or the comparison that I made in showing that you can't have those two, that was kind of begging the question a little bit, because I was supposing that we have a definition which we haven't actually defined what it is yet. So I'm going to go to that now, but that's just, I wanted to illustrate that it's possible that they can conflict, right? You can have different notions of equalities that are conflicting, and that you can't have all of them at the same time, so you have to pick.
Absolutely.
Right, and so let's go straight to equality of outcome, because I think that's the better one to focus on first, because in some ways that's the most straightforward one, although both of them are difficult concepts that you can define in multiple ways and that are not necessarily clear, because if people use them in some ways, or other people use them in different ways, and then they argue about which notion is better, even though it's not necessarily that productive, right? And so then, because that whole discussion is about morality and about policy and about practicality, these things just get lumped together, and the discussion that comes from that is just like snowballing into something that you don't want, because it's all conflating everything together, what you want, what is right, what is practical, what is achievable, right? And so it results in a big mess.
It doesn't sound like a productive conversation now.
And so a nice definition of equality of outcome that I know some academics use, but they use it not as formal definition, but a nice shorthand to kind of put across the basic notion, is that it's equalizing where people end up rather than where or how they begin, right? And so that's kind of self-evident. That's something that people can agree on. I would say that if you contrast it like that, then that's something that is quite clear. But this definition, you see that this definition already implies that equality of outcome is contrasted with equality of opportunity, right? Because
so
it's saying
it references the opposing definition in its own definition.
It's saying equalizing where people end up rather than where or how they begin, which implies that where or how they begin is equality of opportunity, which is not equality of outcome, right?
You could just kind of cut it midway through and just say equalizing where people end up.
Yep.
Which is just the outcome focus of it. And you don't necessarily need the additional stuff that refers to equality of opportunity in the definition.
I mean, that would be reasonable, but at the same time, where people end up sounds a bit opaque. Sounds like I don't really know what you're talking about, because what does that mean, where people end up, right? And so I think the latter part is there to kind of clarify what you mean, even though it implicitly says, okay, this is how we frame the discussion, which is a bit sus for me. And so how the discussion often or typically goes is that you hold the discussion on whether to equalize, what to equalize, and how to equalize. And that process of equalization is the focus, because you have no equality of outcome naturally occurring. Like, okay, you can have some limited circumstances under which you will have uniform outcomes, but that's not really something that tends to happen, right? Nature is kind of diverse, human lives are diverse, people are diverse. That's like, inequality is like baked into our existence, and so it's not something that exists naturally. So if you're talking about equality of outcome, you necessarily have to talk about equalizing something, because that's not how it actually is now. Right?
Yeah, if things were left without any interference, it certainly there wouldn't be equal outcomes. So it's trying to divert something that, I suppose, this isn't the best term for it, but a natural order, which I don't really like that term, but you get what I'm getting at here.
Yeah. And so what do you equalize then? So what are the possibilities if you ask what to equalize and how to equalize, right? So you could equalize, for example, in income or wealth, right? That's usually something that is cited. It's often part of kind of public political discussion. You can equalize incomes or equalize wealth, and whether you can actually do it properly, like that's a different discussion. We'll come to that in a second, but it's something that is kind of easy to aim at, right? You can say this is something that everyone kind of has, that is a feature of our existence. We just have some kind of income from work or whatever, from handouts or whatever, right? Different sources. Either way, you have an income, because without an income of some way or another, you would just die. And so you need to have an income, and then you have things around you that you own. And so income and wealth are the things that everyone shares, so it's kind of easy to focus on when you're trying to define what equality of outcome is. And this would be fine, but the problem is that people have different kind of goals and values and valuations of things, right? And so if you say, okay, I'm gonna equalize income across people, we're not talking about how you do it or whether it's right. If you say you're gonna do that, well, how are you actually going to do that? Because equalizing nominal incomes, well, that doesn't mean that you equalize real incomes, because people value money differently. Some people value money a lot, some people value money less, some people want to buy things that don't cost a lot of money, and some people want to buy things that cost a lot of money, and they value those things roughly the same.
So the outcome in kind of purely monetary terms is only one interpretation of how you could interpret equality of outcome, in that you could say equality of people's value of money, which is perhaps not the best way of putting it, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, but exactly, that's the problem, because then you run into situations where you have to compare people's valuations of different things, and those are subjective and not really comparable, right? So you can't just say, okay, I value this TV twice as much as you, right? It's not possible to compare it like that, right? It would be possible if we were to have an auction and you would say, okay, I'm willing to buy it for X, and I would say I'm willing to buy it for 2X, right? But at the same time, that would it'd be one kind of proxy, but not completely, because I could have at my disposal a different amount of money that I would be willing to spend on anything than you, and then so just me saying I'm willing to spend 2x on that, then and you only x, well, that just can reflect what I already have, not how much I actually value it. So it is kind of a proxy, a price of something, a price that someone's willing to pay for it, but not completely. And so I don't think you have a way of comparing people's valuations of things too well.
Well, this is a behavioural economics question, really, and this is actually something that an area I've specialised in, and I know you can do it, but it's still a relatively blunt tool, and I would just think it wouldn't be practical to do this for everything, in that it takes a lot of work and a lot of research and a lot of data to be able to establish how people value things differently, and how much as a percentage of their resources they're willing to give up for something, and there's lots of different measures that you can take to do so, and I just think from a practical standpoint it's just really impractical if you were to use that as some kind of societal wide thing.
I'm actually interested in what those methods are, because I don't think it is actually possible to do it. So how do you do it? I have a car and you have a car, and we want to figure out whether I value my car more than you value your car. How would you go about doing that?
Well, that's a really broad question, and it might take me like 10-20 minutes to answer, but I can give you kind of a quick overview of what kind of things I would look at. You might look at as I mentioned before, you would look at the percentage of your resources, so maybe your disposable income, but also obviously people own possessions which they could sell in order to get more resources if they so need to. So it's better not just to look at disposable income, because people don't just purely use that. They're willing to forgo some of their possessions if it means they get more income to do stuff. So that's why you'd look at it from that perspective. You could also look at you could ask them their self-reported value. You could just say, how much do you rate this on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being I cannot live without it, 1 being it doesn't matter to me at all. And perhaps you could ask a series of questions, design some kind of psychometric test, which you would have to, of course, test and retest to establish the validity. So it'd be a bit of a headache, but you might be able to get some kind of questionnaire where you can establish how much people value a specific car, or their specific car in this case. And although it would take a huge amount of work and it'd probably be a massive waste of time for everyone involved, you might be able to do it, and you would at least have a reasonable idea, but it wouldn't exactly be precise. And there are, of course, lots of other ways as well, but I don't want to go into it too much because it'll take forever to explain.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you can find ways to approximate that a little bit, right? You will never arrive at the kind of correct answer, because that's something that is subjective, and that you need to find ways to can have a rough idea, but you can't know that precisely, right?
Yeah, it's such an abstraction from kind of human thought and behavior that it's very difficult to kind of say this is the approximate figure. Like this person values their car 7.5 out of 10 or something. You're like, well, what does that mean? There's no meaning there and you've got to use a numerical value because to establish this, you've got to approach it quantitatively to be able to test and retest whether there's significant differences and such. But that's boring logistical stuff of data science, which I will not get into.
So let's. I think we can reasonably agree on that it's difficult, close to impossible, and takes a lot of time and effort. And
I think it's a waste of time. If you wanted
to do it across the board, you would need to do it all the time, and you would not have the physical resources to do it all the time for everything, with changes and valuations every second that people it's not possible to actually find out what people value on a large scale continuously for everything that exists. Like that's not something that would be feasible, right? So you can equalize income in terms of money. Like let's say you could do that. Well, then that doesn't mean your actual incomes are equal, because you value that income in different ways, right? So your real income is different from your nominal income, and I don't mean inflation. I mean personal valuations of what you have and what you can have and what you can buy with the income. And it's the same with wealth, right? So wealth for someone is something that is a means to an end. For someone, it's an end in itself. For someone, it's a status thing. There's a different function that wealth performs for people, and so you have, and then of course you have different extent of people's kind of holdings, right? People are differently wealthy, and so you can say that okay, it's not proportional how each piece of that wealth, like what it brings to anyone, and then it of course doesn't bring the same amount of satisfaction to everyone, because people are different and people have different preferences and different values. And so it's a never-ending kind of quagmire of things, of valuations, that you can't really equalize income and wealth because you don't know what that is. You could equalize that in a very narrow way, in the kind of monetary way, but that doesn't say anything about the real valuations. So you can't do that in practical terms. So if you say, okay, I'm going to equalize income, that's enough for me, well, that's kind of a cop-out, because that's only very narrow, limited kind of extent of equality, if that's what you value.
Yeah.
And
so both in principle really and in practice it doesn't seem particularly feasible, at least from my perspective.
And so if the world is then kind of infinitely diverse in this way that we've just described, you can only equalize a limited part of it, right? That you won't be able to equalize even close to everything if that's what you would like to do. So then that question has to be asked: if your ethics, if your political value, if your political ideas about what is right and wrong are based on equality of outcome, then if you will only ever be able to affect a small sliver of that infinite diverse world, will almost everything in the world always be kind of evil for you? Like that is that something that how you will see the world, right?
Because you're never going to achieve this perfect equality of outcome.
Yeah.
So
and not even perfect, not even close, right?
Yeah.
So no matter what you do, no matter what you can do and what you can imagine that you would be able to do, a large kind of the majority of what's happening in the world will always be unequal. So is it always going to be evil? Is it always going to be something that's unjust, right? And so that is kind of a psychological problem, I think, because how are you going to live with that?
I mean, someone who's 4 foot tall is never going to be a professional basketball player, no matter how much you help them out. Maybe you get them some stilts and you train them on these stilts so they can compete. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, people are naturally imbued with certain competencies in some areas and deficits in others, and you can't really change that without ridiculous and catastrophic consequences in many cases.
And so someone could accuse me or us of strawmanning the equality of outcome position now, because we've taken some kind of idea that someone could have and then just explained how that's not really feasible and what that could lead to, like how that would be a problem for someone who would believe that. But real advocates for equality of outcome usually advocated for a limited in a limited way, in limited scenarios, right? So let's take one that is kind of put into practice quite often, and that is something that actually happens in the world and that we know that a lot of people support, so that we're not strawmanning
Sure.
the equality of outcome position. And that limited scenario will be affirmative action, which is something that we're all familiar with, maybe personally, maybe not, but we know what it is, and it's happening across the world. And so what it is entry requirements into organizations. That's what it's about, or entry requirements, or maybe tests within, so things like that. Usually you look at kind of hiring practices or entry into higher education or any kind of education. And so what you do is that you look at some results, usually test results, and you divide those test results by some groups according to what you want to focus on. And then those groups, you observe whether those groups in aggregate tend to have lower or higher scores on that test or on that measurement, and then you try to change it, or then you change it arbitrarily. You say, okay, I can see that this group that I've defined just here, on average, has 5% lower results than this other group, so I'm going to make it artificially. I'm just going to add 5% to it, just to equalize those results across the board. And so this is something that is sometimes done, that is done in universities, that is done in some organizations when it comes to hiring. Of course, it's been controversial, right? Because people have been arguing that this is unfair, this discriminates against some people, and therefore you have different methods of doing it. For example, in the US, you had this, in the beginning of affirmative action, you had this kind of practice that there were reserved spots for a group that they wanted to have
encouraged to go into this area, I suppose.
And so, and that group had reserved seats or reserved slots in that group that you wanted to admit, and that was actually pronounced unconstitutional. And so, what they needed to change it to was that, okay, we're going to take these results and we're going to bump them up, and that is possible, right? That is something that was declared as constitutional, but the reservations of those places wasn't. So that's kind of an interesting piece of history, that you have a different ways of doing affirmative action like that. That is, but some of them have been deemed unacceptable in political terms.
Yeah, I remember looking at affirmative action when I wrote an article on our website about the framing effect, and it looked at how the tone had changed between just should do. It was specifically framed in terms of African Americans in the United States, and the question kind of pre-1984 is, do African Americans deserve special privileges based on their kind of past history? And then the question changed after 1984 to is it fair for African Americans to be privileged in this way by being selected for? And it's kind of interesting just how even the same policy can be framed in different ways as well. There's a bit of a tangent there, but it's looking at it from two different perspectives, although it is the same exact issue being approached in the same way.
Yeah, and so what are the classic criticisms, right, of affirmative action? I have a couple here. So one criticism is that you will have people who will get in because of that affirmative action, but who are not actually qualified to get in because they're not as skilled, or as they're not experts in whatever they did the test in, and so they will have a hard time in the actual institution, for example, in the university, when they get accepted, and the university programs are tuned to people who pass the test, so who show a certain level of expertise, then those people who will be admitted based on affirmative action will have a hard time and will be dropping out en masse. So that is a problem, right? Another classic criticism of it is that people will start to view every member of that privileged group of people as a diversity hire, no matter whether that particular person is actually a diversity hire or not. There of course are people who would still get in even if their scores weren't bumped up. And so those people get the short end of the stick because they're being viewed as those who gained that position through this action, even though they hadn't.
It is demeaning to the people who get in legitimately, just from a kind of psychological perspective, because they may have got there through their own hard work, and then they might get the perception that they were only there because of the standards being lowered for them, or they may not actually know whether they themselves had been let into this institution or this workplace because of lowered standards, which isn't really good for people's self-esteem. And if you want people to develop in a healthy way, you want them to feel like their achievements are their own. You don't want them to feel like they've been given special treatment, because then they'll feel like they hadn't done anything to deserve the position that they're in. And that's not a nice place to be.
That's a very good point as well. Yeah. And so another one could be that you stoke, by doing that, by practicing affirmative action, you stoke animosity and resentment among the groups that are then kind of pitted against each other, because they feel like people tend to see it as not fair, right? Fundamentally, most people see it that way.
I certainly see it that way.
And so those people will kind of be angry at that group that is being advantaged, because they will see it as, okay, they didn't deserve this, this is something that they shouldn't have, and that will produce that resentment. And if you argue that, okay, you need to do this for some higher purpose or for some end that is just, you need to acknowledge that this is what is going to happen, because people usually tend to see it that way. So you will produce that conflict nonetheless, right? And that's an important point to consider, like whenever you are in this debate, right? Whenever you support affirmative action or not. And then, so these are the kind of classical criticisms of it. Those are in like all the books and all the resources about that. But what I think is the most important criticism that is not one of those is that lower test results, if you have the disparity, on average some group of people tends to score lower. Well, if you see it as a problem, then that's not actually the problem, right? That's a symptom of an underlying problem somewhere else. Maybe those people have had worse education, have had worse opportunities, right? Or I don't know, something like that, right? You don't know what that is if you don't look into it. So you can look into it and you can figure out, why do these people score low on these tests? Is it something that needs to be addressed? Is it something that is unfair to those people somewhere before they took the test, because the tests are they show something, but they're not the problem in itself, they're a symptom. So you don't fix the problem by eliminating the symptom, right? So if you make their test scores higher, the problems that are there in the background are still there in the background. You're not eliminating them just by saying, okay, we've said that these scores will have a +5 added to them. Right? This is not a solution. This is you ignoring the problem.
I think that the people who advocate for this approach it with a kind of understanding that people who are disadvantaged may have lower test scores, but their actual intellectual ability, say, is going to be equal of that of people who have higher test scores, but it's just that the circumstances have held them back. And they're saying that if you remove these limitations and you let them into these prestigious institutions, for example, then there's going to be less limitations on them, and actually they have a greater potential in this case, which I can kind of understand, but I just don't. I think the unfairness of giving people an extra advantage, it outweighs this.
So that could be an option, but at the same time, it is still something that you're trying to mitigate. You're not trying to solve the underlying problem, right? So you said that they didn't have the opportunities to kind of actualize that excellence that they have, or that potential that they have. And so this is still the problem that you have, even if you accept them to those prestigious institutions and you offer them that option to or position to get ahead in life or something like that, if you regard it as that.
In admissions, though, let's carry on with the example of like a university, say. You would ideally want to hire people based on their academic abilities, not necessarily their test scores, because that's just an approximation of their abilities. And therefore, I am somewhat sympathetic to the idea that people may have lots of abilities, but they may not have had the situation that manifests it in a test. And there's also just simply the fact that some people who are very smart don't do very well in tests as well. And it's relying on, I think the problem here in kind of mitigating for this difference in the test outcomes is that you can't really approximate very accurately why there are these differences in the first place. And that's one of the problems. And also, even if you were able to, how do you compensate for that fairly? And that, I think the logistical element of that is what is the real drawback of this, because it's just simply not very feasible or practical to do that.
With the first point that you said, I tend to agree, because I'm also sympathetic to that point of view. At the same time, by accepting those people, fine, you can do that. You don't have to do that. But even if you decide to do that, you haven't actually addressed the primary problem, which is the lack of opportunities that they have had, even though they evidently want that position or they want that in life. They've chosen that kind of path. So how come they didn't have those opportunities? Can you do something about that, right? And if you start practicing affirmative action, what you tend to do is you tend to say, okay, we've now fixed this, so this is not a problem anymore, right? And so that's what I think is quite pernicious, right, about it, is that it's a plaster over something that is still there, and you even in the best case scenario, you're only mitigating for something that you still aren't addressing.
I understand your point, and I do agree, but I think the proponents might suggest that in letting them into perhaps a more prestigious institution or a better workplace where they get paid more, perhaps, then you're giving them more resources to sort out their own problems for themselves. Almost, you could make that case, and although I don't necessarily agree with that, I understand that there's at least a somewhat valid argument there for doing so. And it's not as if you can't, like a similar principle might be accepted in a court where if someone does something like punches you in the face and you take them to court and they pay you some money, well, it's not like it heals your face. It's not like a perfect solution to your original problem, but there's an understanding that with some greater resources, you can go about perhaps sorting it out for yourself. And although it's not satisfactory, it's at least better than doing nothing.
But in that analogy, the proper solution, I'm not saying the justice system or anything like that should do that, but the equivalent thing in that analogy is solving the problem that caused me to punch you in the first place, right? And so why did I punch you? Like what was the problem, right? And solving that problem, like that's the equivalent of it. Not kind of healing my nose or whatever.
I obviously agree with you, but I'm trying to play devil's advocate here. But at the same time,
but I see your point.
To the victim though, it's more in the punch in the face situation. It would be better for them to get the compensation than to know that this person is not going to do it again unless that it's going to happen to them again. Maybe then they'd have a bit of an incentive, but chances are
that's why I want to specify that the criminal justice system is not a good example of this, because that has different dynamics. We talked about that in previous contemplations actually, so you can check that out. But yeah, so I wanted to so another problem of like this is the problem that I think is the most serious. But then an interesting view of it is that So, for example, in the US, you've got affirmative action that is often based on race, right? That's like the typical thing in the US. And so, based on Supreme Court cases and decisions in the past, there is an encyclopedia entry that I'm taking this from, so I'm quoting from there. Quote, affirmative action is no longer justified on the basis of redressing past oppressions and injustice, but in terms of a compelling state interest in diversity at all levels of society. And so that's an interesting kind of turn of events, because everyone agrees that this is how affirmative action started. That, for example, you had the view that because there used to be some injustices in the past, you need to make them right by privileging a certain group of population, and therefore you make it right faster. You have compensation for those past injustices. But at some point, this has switched, and this other point is now relevant as well. And this is actually from one of those Supreme Court decisions, is that yes, you can have that justification of past injustices, and that can be acceptable in some circumstances, but at the same time you also have this other justification, which is a compelling state interest in diversity. So which sounds a bit eerie.
I don't really know what it means by that compelling state interest. That just sounds like kind of like, we're threatening you to do this. That's what it sounds like. That's the only, and that's like the most charitable interpretation. Like, we are compelling you, states, to do what we say.
Yeah, and so my interpretation of this is that if it started as redressing past wrongs badly, in my opinion, then it moved on to overt racism further down the line, because now you're saying, okay, I'm going to judge people based on race in this specific case, just because I have an interest in racism, apparently. Or not me, but the state, apparently. So
it's one of those weird things where it seems to actually be making the problem worse in some senses, because if you're trying to solve past racism, discriminating based on race as a policy enforced by the government, that seems a very counterintuitive way. But
like it seems very racist in and of itself.
Exactly,
that's one thing, and the other thing is that it's going to produce more racism, more racist tendencies
because
among people themselves, because
there are real legitimate differences there, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to cause animosity.
Yeah. And so the last thing that I wanted to say about affirmative action is that it's in some ways it's rooted in Marxism, specifically that one of Marx's arguments was that you need to recognize that people are different, and so that if you want to equalize them, you need to treat them unequally, because if you treat them equally, they will gonna end up unequal. So you need to treat them unequally because they're unequal by design, and so to achieve an equal outcome, you need to treat them unequally. And so I'm going to quote from Ed Rugsby, who was a socialist intellectual at Oxford. Quote, one of the things that Marx is trying to show is that for a rough equality of condition to be obtained, inequalities between individuals are necessary, since we all require and desire different things in different proportions in order to flourish. To treat people as if they are exactly the same is, in fact, to treat them unequally. And so that is, that is something that makes sense if what you want to do is produce equal outcomes, equal results. Right?
Yeah. That seems to kind of summarize that view nicely.
And we're actually going to come back into a bit later into Marx and communism and socialism to see how this is not be a complete picture. But for now, let's move on to equality of opportunity, because we've had a little bit of an exposition of equality of outcome, in particular that affirmative action part of it, because that's something that a lot of people will agree that this is something that is real, that people advocate for. This is not something that we just made up and we're defeating a straw man.
Sure.
So equality of opportunity. It's not actually easy to define either, because it doesn't always mean the same thing. So one option is to say that you have an equal starting point, and everyone has an equal starting point. And having that is that equality of opportunity. So whatever competition, whatever piece of race you enter into, well, the starting point should be the same, and then it just depends on the individuals how far they can get. And that might be one view of it, but that also means that, for example, if you were talking about opportunities in life or kind of options or prospects, let's say, you need to take into account things like inheritance, upbringing, family situation, things like that. That gets a bit problematic, because if you say, okay, children don't have the same starting point in life in general, as in if you view life as this kind of competition where you are trying to get ahead of others, well, then these things are a problem for you, because those are not the equal starting points. And so this is something that is not. This is something that is a problem for this conception of equality of opportunity, because defenders of equality of opportunity are usually not willing to go this way and go that far, right?
I would describe myself as someone who's in favour of equality of opportunity, but I think this is just equality of outcome by a different name almost. In that why would you? It's not practical to. In many cases, to lift people up to the same level, say, especially with upbringing and stuff like that. So you'd have to pull people down, and that just makes everyone worse off. And it's like the prototypical communist perspective, and I would not support that under any circumstances.
So because this is kind of the view that a lot of defenders of equality of opportunity have, this view is not popular, right? And so it needed to change. And so another option, what it could mean, how it is usually marketed to people that are not fully on board, not fully invested in egalitarianism in general, is that it's a different view of equality of opportunity. And I'm going to quote from an encyclopedia again. Equality of opportunity requires that jobs in economic firms and options to borrow money for investment purposes, such as starting a business, should be open to all applicants, that applications be assessed by relevant criteria of merit, and that the top-ranked applicant should be offered the job or option to borrow. Right, and so that's quite narrow. Why talk about borrowing? That sounds a bit weird, but whatever. You get the gist of it, right?
Yeah.
So if you encounter a situation where you have to be judged against other people based on how suitable you are for a certain position or role, it should be based on your achievements, on your ability, on your merit or something like that, not on your immutable characteristics.
This is certainly the impression of equality of opportunity that I had before coming into this, in that I just see it as something that's almost a synonym of meritocracy, in that people get what they deserve because they are the best at what they do, and it's not based on their background. It's just whether you are good or not is the only relevant factor, and all of the other details are irrelevant. And I think that's the perspective that I'm happy with, at least.
And so we'll explore that perspective a little bit just in a bit, but let's just note in the meantime that maybe the stress on what equality of opportunity is actually seen to be has moved back a little bit from this to that first view, because I'm quoting now from Anne Phillips from 2004. It's in the notes below. She says that only a few people hold this narrow view anymore, which is this view is quite narrow, right? That's what it's regarded as in the broader discussion, because it's the equality of opportunity is only limited to the specific circumstances of hiring someone or picking someone for, I don't know, a job or a position, right? And so it's not something that would be universal, that would be applicable to all kind of ways of life and all problems in life. And so that's why it's called a more narrow view, and that's why she calls it a more narrow view. And she says that fewer and fewer people actually hold this view, because most people nowadays would say, most intellectuals, I guess, that the crucial difference is between things beyond one's control and the things that are the result of personal choice, right? And that would be the dividing line between what should be equalized and what should not be equalized, right? That should be the criteria, and not just simply, okay, let's see when you're hiring someone or when you're accepting someone for a position, right? That's not enough, not specific enough. It sometimes produces something that is unjust, and doesn't produce something that would be just. And so things beyond one's control versus the result of personal choice. Well, that then it falls back into that first definition, right? Because if you're born with, I know, a low IQ or something, you're not like that. You haven't chosen that, right? That wasn't your fault. And if you want to get ahead in life, it's going to be more difficult for you if you want to do something intellectual, right? And so that's something that is not a personal choice. That's something that is beyond one's control. And so that is something that should be the subject of equalization under equality of opportunity, right? Because you haven't chosen that. It's not something that you have any control over. So that's the kind of view that people tend to gravitate towards if they support equality of opportunity, just because the important thing is actually what you can choose and what you can affect and what you can't affect.
I see that almost moving towards equality of outcome in a way, because I think a reasonable number of people who believe in equality of opportunity don't necessarily see the same distinction between what's in one's control and personal choice. I don't doubt that there is a cross section of society that does see it that way, but in a sense that people's choices are the important thing. That just simply informs whether they are fit for the role, and that kind of informs their merit. And I suppose the things beyond one's control as well would also feed into that. But it doesn't really matter where the competence comes from, as long as they are right for the position. It doesn't really matter.
I mean, I can see your position, but I don't see how it's an equality of opportunity, because you want people to be equal in their opportunities to do something. That's kind of the definition of it. And so if they're not equal because they start with some attributes that they can't control that are different among those people, then that's not that equality of opportunity, right? And so you can say, yes, well, unfortunately, you can do nothing about it, or doing something about it would be unjust. You can say that, and I would agree. But you can't say that that's equality of opportunity if you don't do that, or if you're not aiming at that.
It seems like a counterintuitive definition to me, because just how the term is actually used in modern political conversations. Maybe it's just used wrong most of the time. I mean, it could be. I don't know, but
I don't think one is right or wrong. To be fair,
but the position that I'm suggesting, I don't feel that that's necessarily particularly uncommon among like-minded people, and yet people who have this view are more likely to refer to it as equality of opportunity. And I think when they use that phrase, they may mean simply that all applicants are considered equally but are ranked based on their merit, and that's the kind of equality part, in that you're not going to say, okay, well, you have this specific demographic detail, so we're not going to consider you even if you are the best. That's kind of how people view it, and I think that's how it's informed by history, in that people understand that people were discriminated based on whether they were a man or a woman, or what race they were, and such in the past. And therefore, when it's viewed, when the term equality of opportunity is viewed in that historical context, people see it in that light. And I think that's the way I have looked at it before as well.
Yep. I think that's a reasonable position to have. Like, it's not something that I would condemn or something like that. That sounds logical. At the same time, I feel like if you have the term equality of opportunity and you want to actually make those words mean what they're supposed to mean, well, then you have to go into that discussion of what is actually opportunity and what is equality. And if you want people to have the same opportunities, you have to look at whether how they started is just or unjust, or whether it's their own doing or not, right? So I feel like those terms almost force you to have that discussion, even though you can, of course, view it in the way that you just described, and many people do.
I think it is a case of the actual terms themselves objectively mean something different to what many of the people who advocate for them actually believe. And I think there is a certain distinction there. And I've never actually really considered it before, that equality of opportunity is actually a bad way of communicating the ideas that I support, because I simply support people getting their positions based on merit,
Yep.
and how they got that merit is inconsequential. That's the only thing that should be focused on, because it involves the least amount of discrimination on things that may otherwise be unfair, in my view at least.
And so let's say that we take this narrower view, because that's what you hold, right? And so let's take that. So the view is that organizations or market participants should not discriminate based on immutable characteristics. They should discriminate based on merit, because that's the relevant thing for whatever you want. And so a question is important here, whether that thing is an ethical goal, an ethical value, or whether it's an enforceable policy, right? Those are very different things.
Sure.
Because you can say that non-arbitrary discrimination might be something nice to value, that might be a good thing to do. You might be a bad person if you decide who to hire based on the color of their skin. Like, that might be a bad thing to do. But legal enforcement is a different question, because that question is, are you willing to use force against that person who's discriminating in this way, arbitrarily in this way, right? And so that is a very important question, because most people who talk about equality of opportunity in this way that you just described, they support things like the civil rights amendments in the US, and the kind of this type of legislation, not against kind of discrimination in the workplace and things like that, in hiring and these things.
Yeah.
But that is kind of conflating two different issues, right? You're not asking whether it's right or wrong. You need to ask whether you're justified to use force against someone who does something wrong. And specifically, you need to ask yourself whether that is just or proportional, that you're using force against them, right? Because it's what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that proportionality is one of the defining characteristics of justice in if not most theories of justice. And so if someone's doing something wrong, well, you can kind of redress that by doing something wrong to them, and it's not actually wrong if you do that to them, because it's proportional. It's either to punish them for doing something wrong or to prevent them from doing something wrong. But if someone is discriminating against someone based on the color of their skin or something like that, how you're reacting to it by creating those non-discrimination laws is you're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna take money from you. I'm gonna stop you from doing what you're doing, the business that you have. I'm gonna use violence in that way against you. And you need to ask yourself, is that proportional? Is that justified? Is that just what you're doing? Is that a good response?
It's certainly a difficult thing, and I think I'm going to talk about the UK simply because it's what I know, having lived here, and I think that there certainly is some discrimination that goes on, and the reason that a lot of it kind of goes under the radar, like for example, you can go to like a lot of barbers in the UK will hire exclusively a certain kind of ethnicity depending on who the owner is, and that's just a consequence of kind of in-groups preferring one another. And although in principle I don't necessarily agree with it, it's very difficult to prove that they've done so, because how do you prove that they've not checked all the candidates and they just preferred the merits? Judging merit is a subjective thing. So in the first case, it's very difficult to say, well, you've discriminated here, you've only hired, say, lots of people of one ethnicity. This seems a bit suspicious. Surely they're not all hired based on merit alone. And the second is that you kind of need to establish, well, we have concrete evidence to prove that you've been discriminating against, and more often than not, that you're not going to find that just but because of the nature of, say, that the hiring process is that it's someone's choice, and their thoughts don't leave notes behind. It's difficult to prove it objectively that they have done so. Just from a practical perspective, it's very difficult to enforce in the first place, and that's led me to kind of think that although it's a principle that we should strive for, even if we were to try and enforce it, it would be unenforceable. So it's one of those things where I can kind of be sympathetic to both sides of the discussion, and I don't really know what the solution is because it's a very complicated thing. But I kind of see that the point that it's not really fair to force people to do something they don't want to do, but at the same time, I don't like people's opportunities being limited based on people making discriminatory choices either. And it's one of those situations where it's two of my principles of giving people the free choice to do what they want and to avoid people being unfairly discriminated against, where I can't really come to a satisfying solution to that. But I feel like it is perhaps one of those things that isn't necessarily as severe in practicality, just because of the logistical difficulties that you might come into enforcing such a law.
I think that a good solution to that dilemma that you just laid out is to judge or to assess that by that proportionality principle. Is that okay? Someone might do something shitty, someone might do something bad, and I might not like it. But what am I supposed to do about it? What can I do about it? What am I justified to do about it? And if someone, I don't know, if someone behaves like that, right? If someone just is a genuine racist and like hates people of a certain color, well, then my response can be, okay, I'm not gonna associate with that person. I'm not gonna extend my sympathies towards them if something happens. I'm not gonna. I'm gonna try to distance myself from them. If I have a business or something, if I produce something, I'm gonna not sell to that person, for example, or something like that, right? I can do these things. This is my response that I can do with my own body and my own property, and that's fine. But then, if you say, okay, that person has done something I don't like, but it's not actually hurting like someone's person or property, well, can I actually interfere with that person's body or property if they hadn't done that to anyone else, right? That's a good kind of rule of thumb for me, just so to assess whether I'm acting proportionally or not. And of course, in practice, it's not usually me acting in some way or another, but being able to tell whether what the state does is right or wrong. Right? And so that's kind of my approach to it, is that in this dilemma, you need to look at the two sides and compare what they're actually doing, and whether, if one side does something that is wrong, whether the other side is justified in reacting the way that it does.
Yeah, and although I'm certainly more sympathetic to giving people the free choice argument there is kind of a point to be made about the fact that, say, let's use the kind of business hiring thing as an example. You could say, well, this business, for some reason they don't want to hire a particular group of people, and in this business existing and excluding this particular group of people, if they want to work in this industry, this business just in being in existence, it takes a certain share of the market.
Yep.
And therefore, even if the people have a free choice to go to other employers that are more willing to hire them, the fact that this business exists makes it more difficult for this specific group. And therefore, you can kind of understand why there are people advocating for some degree of intervention, because due to no fault of their own, this group of people that are being discriminated against are being limited based on something that they can't control, and it does seem to me to be an unjust thing, because it is an imposition on their opportunity to be employed. But it's one of those things where also, that business has the freedom to make their own choices, And this is, again, taking me back to that dilemma, but I'm kind of explaining why, perhaps in better terms, people might want to intervene, because there are real consequences to this business saying, oh, we're not going to hire this group of people, because it damages them, even if it is in a small way.
No, don't get me wrong. I definitely understand the impulse behind it and why those people want to do it. Well, that's why I'm saying it's important to really ask that question: what is
Okay,
proportional,
yeah.
what is not, what is justified, and what is not. Because if you carry out a response that is disproportionate, that is something that is not justified, well, then you're the one doing the wrong thing, right?
Of course, yeah.
Even if that person might have done something wrong, you're doing something wrong as well. And so you need to really look at what you're doing and whether that is justified or not, whether it's a good response. It doesn't matter whether you see, even if you see that person doing something wrong, that's still a question that you need to ask before you can actually do something, before you can actually proceed to say, okay, this is something that I am going to do. And so I definitely understand where you're coming from, and that where advocates for this are coming from, because it's an understandable feeling, and I sympathize, right? Because I don't like to see that either. I see it in the same way that you do. But the proportionality and the justification for a particular response is a very important part of the discussion.
Yeah, I would like to kind of add a caveat to what I was saying, in that I don't think two wrongs make a right, and I don't think that I think that in many cases the state stepping in to be the arbiter of punishment is good, because quite often the person who is the victim is not going to be the best person to come up with a proportionate response. I understand this, but I think another one of the difficulties that makes me very hesitant to fall on either side is that obviously there are consequences to this kind of discrimination, but at the same time it's very difficult to come up with a proportionate response as well. Like, how do you quantify the difficulties caused? It's a very difficult thing, and I know people come up with approximate like monetary figures, but it's always very arbitrary, and I feel like it's an unsatisfactory solution to both sides. Although I imagine that if you've been discriminated against in a job application, and you take it to court and you win lots of money, the person who has won all this money is probably going to be happier with that than getting the job in the first place. But in that case, the employer has been disproportionately punished, and it's one of those things where, as you said, the proportional aspect is the difficult thing, but at the same time, I don't feel comfortable weighing down on either side.
So from what you've just said, there's one thing that I need to point out as well, because it's an important point, that you said that you can't really quantify the harm that's being done to that person by being discriminated against. And that's why that you said this, that's the reason why I use the words that I used, as in kind of do kind of damage, or to do physical harm to a person or a property, right? Because you can't judge harm being done by something that happens in people's heads and people's valuation, market valuations, things like that. So I could say, okay, there might be a shop on the street, right? And I might open another shop on the street, and I'm taking some customers away from that first shop. So I'm harming that first shop, but I'm harming it in a very specific way. I'm harming it in a way where it's not a harm that I would cause directly to that property or to that owner kind of personally, but it's something that I cause indirectly through affecting people's behavior and their valuation and their behavior in the market, right? And so things like that are not equivalent to actual harm being done, as in physical harm, right? And so that is something that needs to be distinguished. You need to distinguish between those two, because if you do real physical harm to something, well, then that justifies that different physical response, right? That's what it justifies. That's what makes it proportional. But if you only cause harm that is in people's heads, in people's valuations, in people's behavior. You change people's behavior, and therefore someone might be in a different situation and might be in a worse situation that they were before. Well, that's something that is indirect, and that is happening in people's heads and in kind of society and how it moves around, right? And so you can't judge that in the same way that you judge actual acts of physical violence. And so that necessitates a different kind of response, and that's why I wanted to differentiate between those two, and that's why I wanted to specify what you're justified doing and what you're not justified doing. Because in the case of discrimination, it might be, yes, there might be some damages to you that you incur because of that situation that has inconvenienced you in some way or made you like be in a bad situation, but it's not physical damage that's done to you. It's not kind of harm in this way.
But you still got a similar, this isn't necessarily disagreeing with you at all, but you still got the similar issue of whether recompense for the physical damage is proportionate, and it's still the same issue of establishing this damage in a similar way, right?
So yes, but if you cause someone physical damage, well then your response with physical violence is justified by them doing that in the first place, right? But the question of whether it's proportional or not it's a question of quantity. It's not a question of quality, and I feel like that's a very important kind of point, that it's a different kind of response. So if someone's doing something non-violent but something that might be bad, well, you can do something bad to them in response, bad quote unquote, but also non-violent. You're not justified using violence against them if they use violence in the first right. So that's a step that you can't just make out of the blue, right? That step between, okay, one person has done something that is bad but non-violent, and I'm going to use violence against them now.
Yeah, that's obviously not proportionate.
Yeah. And so that's why I wanted to really drill into that difference between affecting someone's kind of career prospects, selling prospects, buying prospects, whatever, the wealth that they have through other people's valuations, right? If Elon Musk says something bad about a company on Twitter, then that company loses a lot of money, but that doesn't mean Elon Musk has done anything violent towards them, right? Even though they have lots of money, there's a lot of actual impact, but it is a different kind of impact that if Elon Musk came there with a baseball bat and just started smashing the business up, right? And so the response that you can have towards Elon Musk can be, okay, I'm gonna write a bad article about this person. I'm going to convince people that they shouldn't like this person. They shouldn't interact with them. They should condemn them. But I can't just go with a baseball bat to Elon Musk and just start punching him, right? Like, that's not...
Yeah, but you could perhaps take him to court and say, well, he's unduly influenced the success of my company. He's defamed my company.
Exactly, but they're just a baseball bat by different means. It's not you. It's not you. It's the cops doing it. But it's the same kind of ethical principle. That's what I'm like.
I feel like we're going into a huge tangent here, so sorry to take you off of course here.
Okay, so let's go back. We started by talking about equality of opportunity, right, and different ideas about equality of opportunity. And so some of those defending equality of opportunity are Rawlsians. Rawls is a famous philosopher from the second half of the 20th century. He wrote a massively influential book called Theory of Justice, and he's basically someone that everyone needs to talk about today because of the sheer extent of his influence. And so some of those defending equality of opportunity are Rawlsians, which means in this particular context that they defend some inequality under some circumstances, right? And so he's not, even though he's fairly classified as an egalitarian theorist, he also defends some inequality under some circumstances. When he says inequality is only acceptable if it benefits the most disadvantaged member of society, right? So if you have some kind of inequality, whatever, someone has more money, someone has less money, well, that kind of division, unequal division, can be justified if you can show that the people that are the worst off in society benefit in some ways from that person having a lot of money, even if they don't have a lot of money, right? So, in particular, you could imagine saying, well, if you have a very kind of hard job to do, something that needs to be done, a surgeon or something, right? So something that is really useful, but something that not many people can actually do properly. So, and you need a lot of training, you need a lot of effort, you need a lot of commitment. Well, then you might want to, if you were arbitrarily dividing kind of wages to people, you might want to give that position a larger salary because this job is something that is useful for society, is something that is hard to learn, something that is difficult to do. And the other thing might be to say that you need those people in society, and if you don't offer this disproportionate salary, well, then people will do it less, and you need more people to do it, and so even the poor people in society will prefer that from being more surgeons, enough surgeons, and so therefore you justified offering them more money than a waiter.
That seems perfectly reasonable to me.
So this is, these are very limited circumstances under which inequality is satisfied, because you're still thinking about it from this very top-down point of view of, okay, I'm going to divide these resources between people, and you're not talking about how society actually works or how economics
I know it's just
works.
an analogy to explain the kind of dynamic, isn't it? Yeah.
But so these are the criteria, but then you have, if inequality is only acceptable if it benefits the most disadvantaged people in society, well, then you have several problems, several questions to ask. Well, who is disadvantaged, right? Can define that in a lot of different ways. Someone might be poor, we might enjoy being poor. Yesterday we talked about Buddhism, where people enjoy being poor and they get a lot of kick from it. Right? And so who is disadvantaged is a very subjective view. You might have some people that agree on it, but not everyone will agree on it. You will have a lot of difference in that. You can't just judge that objectively. Who defines it? Who defines who is disadvantaged, right? That's an important view, corollary of that question. You need to pick kind of one view that is going to be decisive. How are you going to pick that? That it's important, because I think if it was according to me, I would say something completely different than Rawls, right? And so that's a problem. Who assesses benefits, right? So if inequality is only acceptable if it benefits the most disadvantaged members of society, well, what constitutes a benefit? We might say, okay, there's a clear example of the surgeon, that benefits in some way. Fine, a lot of people agree on that. But I don't know, like if someone's kind of creating merch for us, is that a benefit to society? I don't know. Benefit to us? Are we a benefit to society? I don't know.
Yes. Yes, we are.
Who assesses that, right? Like this, and most things are like that. Most things are not as clear as that extreme example of that surgeon that most people clearly see as something that is desirable in society, something that is useful even to people at the bottom of society, right? And so most things are not like that in society, and so you need to solve that question. And so then another kind of set of questions to that Rawlsian view is, why would it be unacceptable otherwise? Right? Because he says inequality is only acceptable if it benefits the most advantaged members of society. Why would it be unacceptable otherwise, right? And that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow as well, because that's an important question to ask. But a corollary of that question isn't it important how that inequality originated in the first place? If it's just or unjust or things like that, right? And so you need to ask these things. So even if you're defending equality of opportunity based on kind of this Rawlsian defense of inequalities to some extent, you still need to answer those questions, which are quite difficult and which I don't think anyone can actually answer.
Yeah, I think that's
not completely answer, but you can attempt to answer them. You can get at some kind of solutions, but I don't think you can get at a satisfactory solution. That's something that would be really, okay, now it's a done deal, this is solved. Like, I don't think that's actually possible. And so one of the criticisms of equality of outcome that is that, or equality in general, right, is that it's socialist or communist, right? That's one kind of angle. Equality of outcome is probably the one that is most criticized like that. But if you take the kind of basic form of socialism and communism, like presented by Marx, right? How the economy works, or how resources are distributed. In socialism, you have this short phrase that is from each according to his ability to each according to his work. That's socialism. And communism, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's the more famous one, because that's the kind of communism
scarier one
description of what the division of resources in communism is supposed to be like. Notice that neither of them is egalitarian, right? It's saying people have different abilities, right? So you take from each different things, because they can produce different things, they can contribute different things, and so you treat them very unequally based on their innate inequality. And to each according to his work or need. Well, people are going to work differently. People are going to work less or more, and then people are going to need something, and other people are going to need something else. Some people might need more, some people might need less, and so all these things, that's all inequality, right? And so there's no equality in those things, and so this kind of view of equality of outcome as communism might be justified in some ways, but in others it's very much not, just like because of this, right? Because the of underlying principle behind communism, for example, is that you take different things from each person because they are different. There's no equality there, and you give them different things for the same reason.
But in practice, in a lot of so-called communist countries, they've paid people equal wages despite being different in competence, for example. And
I think this is the Marxian ideal. This is before they were in communist countries. So this is just criticizing the
idea behind it.
The theoretical basis of it.
Of course.
And so, why I think that, just to come back to equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, and why I thought I was arguing in the beginning that that those two notions were like closer together than they might seem at first. I'm going to quote Ed Brooksby again, who is, as I said, a socialist, quite venerated. People liked him very much. He died sadly last year. He says that there is a tendency of liberal ideals to go beyond themselves in the way in which equality of opportunity, on close inspection, slides into equality of outcome. Equality of opportunity requires that each individual has an equal starting point in competition for particular social goods, and outcomes then reflect ability and effort. Well, the problem is that outcomes are also starting points. A child's starting point, for example, might be to be born into an affluent family, but this is the outcome of the parents having successfully made use of their opportunities. This suggests that if we really think it's important to equalize opportunities, we need to equalize outcomes too. And that's the socialist talking. That's him saying, okay, you all the people who are venerating equality of opportunity, you need to realize that it leads you to equality of outcome. That's the argument that I was making earlier, right? So you can be very, in some ways, I don't, it's probably going to sound bad, but you can be a bit defensive about it and saying, okay, I'm going to limit this to this particular view. I'm not going to go beyond it. But the logic behind it kind of, in my opinion, forces you towards it, right? Forces you to consider these other things that will then lead you towards equality of outcome. And that's what I think, that's the argument that he's making, and I tend to agree with him.
I think then that what the point I made earlier, where a lot of people who use the term equality of opportunity do so kind of misunderstanding what it really means, in that they really want just meritocracy. That's all they care about. They just want people to be assessed based on their merit and their merit alone. And I think in using equality of opportunity, although certainly some people use the phrase and truly mean what it really seems to mean in this case, it more often than not, people may actually disagree with the definition of, taking into consideration people's historical context.
Yep.
even though they may say they support equality of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And so another point is that affirmative action that we talked about before is actually sometimes called substantive equality of opportunity, right? It's an interesting turn of events because it is usually classified as something like equality of outcome, but this is actually what it's usually called and what it's called in the literature before it was actually implemented in a lot of countries. And why it was called substantive equality of opportunity is that it was not just formal equality of opportunity. It was not just saying, I'm going to look at the merit, but it looked deeper into the historical context. So what does this merit mean? Is it actually something that people have deserved, something that people have produced through their work or achieved through their work, or is it something that was kind of given to them in some ways, or something that they haven't deserved as much as some others? And so this is that they were just saying that you need that historical context to understand whether the situation that the people find themselves in now is really just or not just. And if it's unjust, well, it's unjust to treat them as if it were just, right? And so that's why the word substantive is there, because you're saying it's not just naive equality of opportunity, just taking into account that formal requirement. It's substantive because you're actually looking at the history of that and whether the situation is just or not.
Sure.
And so that's an interesting thing, that this thing that is usually attributed to equality of opportunity is actually also being called substantive equality of I meant equality of outcome before. It's often being called substantive equality of opportunity as well. So at least in this point, those terms tend to blur in this way, get blurred in this way.
I see what you're getting at.
And so just to kind of wrap it up, some final thoughts. Something that we started with, that's an interesting observation, that this is discussion that we just had is really quite limited, because it's limited to those two concepts, equality of opportunity in the way that you describe it, in the kind of meritocracy, like that the meaning, and equality of outcome, meaning that historical context and mitigating for circumstances beyond your control. And so these two things are the predominant positions in the political discussion today about these types of things, and the discussion doesn't really go beyond that too much ever, which is interesting, but we might be able to fix that tomorrow. And I want to just give a quote from an encyclopedia, where it says that John Shah criticizes the idea that equality of opportunity is a basic definition of equality, because it really only defends the equal right to become unequal by competing against one's fellows, right? And so that's a rehash of that criticism that I said in the beginning, but it's emblematic of what's going on. If you criticize one of them, you criticize it from that point of view of the other, because you necessarily think that one of them is desirable and one of them is not, right? And so that's the whole discussion right there. So this is just something that I find interesting, and I also find interesting to kind of go beyond that. I find interesting that the discussion is limited like that, because it's indicated something's going on, something's not right.
Mm-hmm. I think I've certainly learned that I'm not going to use equality of opportunity anymore. I'm just going to say meritocracy, because it's more specific to what I actually mean, and I think that's what most people mean when they talk about it.
That's a good result for me. So tomorrow we won't look anymore at that kind of limited discussion, but we'll look at egalitarianism in general in kind of more interesting ways. We're going to take a look at what it is, how it is justified, and whether it's a desired goal or not.
Thank you very much for watching, and make sure to tune in tomorrow for our next episode, as well as checking out our website, where we'll have both the reading list and all of our other great stuff. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.